Hello and welcome. Thank you for choosing to attend my session on feedback. My name is Terri Hammatt. I am an instructional strategist with Wayside Publishing, and I've been an educator in Louisiana. I've taught French in Louisiana. I've taught French immersion in Louisiana, and now I work for Wayside, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm a native of Pennsylvania, so super excited. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started. As you probably know, Actful has adopted 6 core practices to guide us in our teaching. Individually, these 6 ideas they're not new ideas. They've been around for a while, but grouping them together as a set of core practices really emphasizes their importance in language instruction. One of these practices, providing appropriate oral feedback, is the reason why I decided to do this presentation today. I feel teachers, myself included, often get stuck in how to provide feedback that is truly helpful to our students' proficiency growth. Most of the research for this presentation came from Actful's publication by Gleason and Donato, Enacting the Work of Language Instruction, High Leverage Teaching Practices. This is the first volume that I'm talking about right now because they recently put out a second volume. So our objectives for today are for you to be able to explain what effective feedback is and what it isn't, identify different types of feedback, recognize when to use different types of feedback, and to distinguish the different roles of a feedback provider. So I think you'll enjoy this. It's very, very interesting. So generally speaking, feedback does not tell students what they should or shouldn't do, and it doesn't tell them what a great job they're doing or they didn't do. What it does do is provide information on students' work. It focuses on what the student has done in a non-judgmental way. Basically, feedback is, how did your student do, and how could they do better? Right now, I'd like you to activate your prior knowledge about when and how teachers provide oral corrective feedback. Think about it just for a second and jot down a couple of ideas. When and how should teachers provide oral corrective feedback? I'll give you just about 10 more seconds. Think about it. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at Elon Musk, the founder of Tesla. He was not a teacher, but his idea here totally applies to the classroom. We want to help students understand where they are and what they need to do to get to the next level. So let's get into some of the nitty-gritty. We're going to take a look at different types of feedback. There's more than 1 or 2 different kinds. There are plenty kinds of feedback. So let's see what they are. So when we give feedback, we can either use prompts or reformulations. A prompt is something that we'd say to students so they notice a mistake and self-correct. Reformulations, on the other hand, are when we provide students with the correct version of what they said. Prompts and reformulations can then be either implicit or explicit. In explicit feedback, we indicate exactly where the problem is, and with implicit, the students have to figure it out. So as you can see with this chart, feedback can fall in the A quadrant, where it is an implicit prompt. It can fall in the B quadrant, where it is an explicit prompt. The D quadrant is an explicit reformulation, and the C quadrant is an implicit reformulation. Can you think of any examples of one of these types of feedback? Prompt, reformulation, implicit, explicit. Well, for example, let's just say if your student said, "Me llamo es Terri," you might use an implicit prompt by saying, "Me llamo es," and raise your intonation. We do that a lot, right, as language teachers. Does that make sense? It's a prompt because I didn't give them the correct way to say it. And I said something so they would notice the error and self-correct. So it's implicit because I didn't specifically identify where the mistake was. Try to think of some other examples of a prompt or a reformulation in English or in your target language. Okay, so now we're going to go over 6 different strategies with examples, okay, for giving feedback. And yes, okay, so yes, that's what we're going to do right now. All right. So our first strategy for giving feedback is super simple. It's to use repetition, which is the example from the prior slide that I just talked about. Repetition is an implicit prompt. I repeat what the student said, but with a change in tone. Let's look at another example. Student says, "I goed to the gym this morning." And the teacher says, "I goed." That's repetition. The teacher simply lets the student know that there is an error, and then the student figures it out and self-corrects. We've all done that. Another strategy is also an implicit prompt, and this is a clarification request. This is just what it sounds like. The teacher asks a question to clarify what the student said. So here's another example. Student says, "I sit next to my friend and my uncle in Spanish class." Teacher says, "Excuse me? What do you mean?" Teacher continues, "Who do you sit next to?" Because it's not quite clear. Why would the uncle be in class? Is the student really sitting next to the uncle? We need clarification. So those are 2 implicit types of prompts, okay? Repetition and clarification requests. Now we're going to move on to some explicit prompts. And we have meta-linguistic feedback. Meta means that the student thinks about his or her thinking. So you are helping students focus on how they said something, and we'll use some linguistic terminology to do so. You'll throw out names of tenses, or maybe you'll talk about adjective agreement or word order and things like that. So for example, the teacher says, "What did you like to do during summer break when you were 12? And the student says, "I play soccer and I like to swim." So the teacher then says, "Are you referring to the past or the present? You need a past tense verb there." So that was our meta-linguistic feedback, okay? That was a prompt strategy that was explicit, okay? Here is another explicit prompt strategy. It's called elicitation. This is where the teacher repeats exactly what the student said correctly, but stops at the point where the mistake was made. So here's an example of this strategy. Student says, "I will go to the concert this night." And the teacher says, "I will go to the concert and waits. And the teacher, by her question, waits for the student to self-correct. Okay, so we've seen two implicit prompt types of error correction. We've seen two explicit types of, explicit prompts. And now we're moving on to the C quadrant with implicit reformulations, the ever famous recast. I did once have to do a project in one of my curriculum and instruction classes, and we had to record an entire class period where we were teaching and then had to transcribe it and look at how we were providing feedback. And I found that I used lots of recasts. That was my go-to strategy. A recast is when you correctly say what the student was trying to say. So you don't bring any attention to the mistake or the mistakes that were made. You just restate it correctly, perhaps in the form of a question, and move on, just hoping the student heard the difference between what you said and what they said. So let's see what this one looks like. Recast. I'm interested in seeing the movies. That's what the student says. I'm interested in seeing the movie. And the teacher says, oh, you're interested in seeing the movie. Think about recasts. I know we've all done that before. We're probably pros at recasts. And our last strategy from quadrant D then is explicit corrections. This is where the teacher points out the mistake and gives the correct way to say it, like this example. Student says, I went to the zoo and I saw giraffes and zebras. Teacher says, oh, you mean, and then gives the correct form. Or you should say, and the teacher gives the correct form. So can you name those 6 strategies? Maybe even think of some examples of each one. I'll give you a second to write those down. Okay, here they are. Repetition, clarification request, meta-linguistic feedback, elicitation, recast, explicit corrections. So of those 6 strategies that we just looked at, which one do you think teachers used the most often? Or maybe which one do you use the most often? And the answer is recasts. No surprise there, right? Recasts are most widely used, but they have the least uptake. And uptake means that the students understand the feedback and they actually make the correction. So let's think about this. Which strategy of corrective feedback do you think most often leads to uptake or correction? Think about it. Which one? Obviously, it's not recast. That's not working too well. All right, the highest uptake is elicitation, where teachers repeat the student's sentence up to the error, and they give the students time to indicate and self-correct. So if elicitation has the most uptake, where the teacher repeats the sentence up to the mistake and waits for the student to self-correct, why do you think that teachers use recasts most often? If elicitation provides them the best uptake, why do we use recasts? And honestly, I don't know if research has been done on this, but I know from my point of view, I always wanted students to feel good about themselves and boost their confidence, because you put yourself on the line when you're speaking a second language. And so I always wanted them to feel feel good about themselves and build their confidence instead of pointing out their mistakes. But elicitation is the best way to provide feedback. So on that note, let's go ahead and talk about when to provide feedback and what kind to give. There was a study by Shrum and Gleason, once again, the authors of the book from which we based our presentation here. There's a study by Shrum and Gleason in 2016, and it found that the type, the quantity, and the frequency of corrective feedback depends on the objectives of a lesson. So what are the teacher's objectives? What are they trying to teach here? The proficiency level of the students, anxiety issues, and maybe personal characteristics of the learner. And Shrum and Gleason found that students benefit most when the feedback they receive focuses on comprehensibility of the message and not just on accuracy of the form. Okay, so it's about understanding and making meaning. That's very important, as well as accuracy. So let's go ahead now, moving on, and take a look at these two words, mistake and error. Are they the same or different? What do you think? Is there a difference between mistake and error? So most people use these words interchangeably, but there is a slight difference in meaning, at least according to some researchers. A mistake is made by students when they incorrectly say something that they really do know how to say correctly. When they realize their error, they can self-correct. For example, if a student said, "She run," and that student knows that third person singular verbs in English need an S. If I said as the teacher, "She run," and provide a rising intonation in my voice, then the student could be like, "Oh yeah, she runs," because they know the correct form, right? So an error, on the other hand, is when students attempt to say something that they have not learned yet. They're taking a risk and they're trying to be creative with the language. I have an example of this from when I was learning French. At the beginning of my junior year abroad, I went into a bank to cash a traveler's check. So traveler's checks were the most secure way of taking money abroad in those days. You had to go to a bank and cash your traveler's checks to get money, in my case, French francs. Anyway, I asked the teller if I could cacher un chèque de voyage at the bank. Since I didn't know how to say the verb to cash, I just took a stab in the dark. I said cacher. Well, the teller looked at me questioningly and then provided me with the correct word, which was really changer un chèque de voyage. I had made an error. I had asked the teller if I could hide a traveler's check in her bank. And she just looked at me. She did not know what I was talking about. And then she realized that I wanted to exchange one. Okay. So I had made an error, and there's no way I would have been able to self-correct and come up with changer un chèque de voyage without being told the correct way to say it. That this was an error and not a mistake. So let's just think about this then. Which should we focus on most when providing feedback? Do we want to focus on mistakes or do we want to focus on errors? Yes, we definitely want to focus on mistakes because they are in the student's zone of proximal development. Okay, they've already learned this, so they will be able to correct themselves. Research also tells us that feedback can be most effective when we actually focus on what learners are doing well instead of on what they are struggling with. building confidence and providing strategies to improve on learners' strong areas, while also helping them with corrective feedback to improve in other areas. We would do well to give specific goals in our feedback as well. Goals that are slightly challenging for students, goals that make them reach to their outer limits. And finally, feedback is most helpful, when we test the way that we teach, when we give feedback on formative assessments that reflect what students will be asked to do on the summative assessment. Learners can take that feedback and apply it in a new context. So now what we're going to do is move on to an activity. We're going to look at those handouts that you have. Okay, there should be a handout on the page here, on the web page, and I want you to access it. I'll show you what it looks like. This is a picture of the handout. So go ahead and take a look at that right now. Okay, so this handout in particular helps to figure out when to provide feedback and when not to. If you remember, we did a warm-up on this topic, right? When we started, we asked you when and how teachers should give feedback, and you jotted down a few notes, okay? So let's see what the experts tell us according to the attached handout. So you've got your handout in front of you, okay? And what you're going to do first, when you're deciding what type of feedback to give or whether to give it at all, you first consider contextual factors, okay? So does the error interfere with the learner's intended meaning? Okay, answer that question. Is the error the linguistic target of the lesson? So is the lesson a focus on form lesson? Also, is the error one that is being made frequently by many learners in the class? If you answer no to those questions, then just completely ignore the error, right? We know language learning can be messy, but if the answer to that in the context is no, then do nothing. If the answer is yes, then what you need to do is consider learner factors. Take those into consideration. So would the learner, think about this, would the learner benefit from receiving corrective feedback? Is it, for example, in their zone of proximal development? And let me tell you, in case you've not heard of this term before, it's a term by a researcher named Vygotsky, okay? And he said that the zone of proximal development refers to the difference between what a learner can do without help and what he or she can achieve with guidance and encouragement from a skilled partner. So the first question then is, would learners benefit from receiving corrective feedback? Is what we're going to teach them, or the feedback that we would give them in their zone of proximal development. Okay. Secondly, is the learner open to receiving corrective feedback? Some learners are definitely not open. Okay. Also, does the learner appear to be confused and in need of corrective feedback to make meaning and or clear up a misunderstanding? Okay. And then does the learner appear to want corrective feedback? All right. So if you answer no to those questions, once again, teachers are advised to ignore the error. Okay. Just ignore it. It's an error. Okay. If you answer yes to those questions, then it is advised from these researchers that yes, you do give feedback. corrective feedback. But now the question is, what kind of feedback? Okay, remember those 4 quadrants that we had. We had the prompt, we had the reformulations, the implicit and the explicit. So figure out what's the best, the prompt or the reformulation, okay? And then if you want students to work in their zone of proximal development, okay, so something that it's the difference between what a learner can do without help and what they can do with guidance and encouragement. If you want them to work in the zone of proximal development, then pick out a prompt, okay? An implicit or an explicit prompt. Maybe a clarification request, maybe an elicitation. Remember, elicitations are the most, the elicitations provide the highest level of uptake for our students, okay? The reformulation, maybe you decide to go with a reformulation to move the interaction forward. And so you might do a conversational recast, or you might provide language that the learner does not know, okay? And as language learners ourselves, we all know that we've been there, okay? Think about which type of feedback probably helps you the most, okay? Anyway, voila, here we go. Okay, so I hope this handout will help you as you're thinking about your own students. So far, everything that we've talked about has been backed by research. The last part of what I want to talk about today is some of my own ideas on the different roles we play in providing feedback. In line with our sports theme here, I'm going to suggest that there are 4 different roles we can play as feedback provider. So let's go ahead and take a look at the 4 different roles. First, the first one is a cheerleader. In this role, we focus on what the student can do and how they are improving. We provide this type of feedback both during and after some type of performance. At the beginning of the presentation, I said feedback is not praise or evaluative, right? I did say that, but as you can see with the examples here, in a cheerleader role, we sometimes do give that kind of feedback. Sometimes our students need that confidence boost. This type of feedback isn't going to help them improve their language skills, but it can help keep them motivated to stick with it and know that they are doing okay. Sometimes as a cheerleader, you can still sneak in some meta-linguistic feedback using a linguistic terminology in your feedback to really get students thinking. So think about that. Some of us are cheerleaders. Okay, it's a really important role to fill, but not all the time. Another role is to be the referee or the umpire, and this is the type of feedback provider that we talked a lot about today. Here you focus on mistakes, so students have the uptake that they want and that they need. You use all the different strategies that we talked about earlier. And this type of feedback should be given during the performance. The next type of role that we play as a feedback provider is the coaching role. In this role, we focus on teaching students strategies to continue along the proficiency continuum. We do this before, during, and after performances or class or whatever, okay? Coaching. And finally, we have the analyst who focuses on evaluating the student's performance after the fact. The analyst talked about what happened and what needs to happen in order to move ahead next time. So think about when you have or would play any of these roles. What type of situations would you play some of these roles? Think of some examples of students and some of the things that they have said. Well, we have come to the end of our time together. So I hope you can explain what effective feedback is and what it's not, that you can identify different types of feedback, that you can recognize when to use different types of feedback, and you can distinguish the different roles of a feedback provider. Have a great day.